Now that we have covered the new player experience, where do you go to learn the game? Which in this context is the core gameplay fundamentals for your game. Just a thing of note, fundamentals and meta are not the same thing. Meta is usually built on fundamentals. Today's video is covering the different ways you can learn those fundamentals and the different resources that are usually available for most games. The first way to do this is both the most organic and also the hardest to do, and that is through observation and trial and error. That is where instead of playing the game to win, you play the game to learn, so that you observe things that you do and the effectiveness of them versus things your opponent does or your teammates do, and gauge their effectiveness through observation as well. And the trial and error aspect, you try a bunch of different stuff and see if it works. Generally, this is how early meta becomes established, but depending on your level of skill and the rate of your development, you may end up with something that is completely different than what is the established meta for that game. And this is the best way to get the most personalized playstyle possible, where it is just you figuring out the game essentially by yourself. A lot of people don't do that though because it's hard. You have to actively think about what you're doing versus what your teammates and opponents are doing in the game. But there is an easier way to do this. If you have, say, a friend group that you all get into the game at the same time and all of you have no idea what you're doing, then you can go for a more collaborative observation and trial and error, where you with a small group are bouncing off information and observations to develop your own unique viewpoint of the game as a group. That can make it easier and it can also make it more fun, but that requires people. Not everyone has access to good friends like that. So if you want an easier approach, there are plenty of other options. The first one I would recommend outside of the more self-developed method is beginner's guides, which any game that is reasonably popular is going to have at least 5 or so YouTubers with beginner's guides on the game. Sometimes the game wiki can even have a beginner's guide as well. But the way I would approach this information is to make sure you do not just take one person's beginner guide. Check out several of them and make sure that the people making these guides have different perspectives on the game. For example, you could find a beginner's guide from somebody that's more casual and look at another guide from a more competitive perspective. That'll give you a more well-rounded approach to the different avenues of the game. And generally, I am in favor of a more well-rounded approach versus a very tunnel-visioned approach. As we'll get into with some of the later options, optimal is not always optimal. But checking out multiple beginner's guides should give you a decent idea of, okay, this is what the game does. Hopefully they go over a few of the basic mechanics as well, and the importance of those mechanics. There is no established curriculum for core gameplay mechanics of an individual game, which is why you need to check out multiple sources. They may have overlapping information, which is usually a good thing, but each may point out unique things that are more important to them that you would not have known if you just looked at the one guide instead of multiple. Generally, I think beginner's guides are relatively safe as long as you look at multiple of them. And as long as the information is foundational enough, these are typically a great resource to use. Next are the more professional guides, which tend to require a certain level of game experience. And as a new player, these are generally not that helpful. They can be helpful down the road, but for someone that's just starting out, they tend to not have that much useful information, and for the moment I would avoid those until you've had enough time with the game to make use of the information that you will get out of those. And I know it's very easy to want to go to those because some pro player could be giving a guide on how to play the game and you're like, that's the information I want because he's a pro. And then you get the information and you realize you don't understand enough fundamentals to actually know how to apply any of that information. So the basics are important and you need a guide that covers those exclusively, which hopefully the beginner's guides do. If not, then trial and error with observation may be your best shot. Next up is the game's encyclopedia, also known as the game wiki. And this can be a great place if you're a very data-driven individual. You want to know the exact specific numbers and mechanics. This is also a great place to figure out game progression, and these do occasionally have beginner's guides, as I've said earlier. And while I do find wikis to be quite helpful, they're helpful if you know how to take the information. And generally, they're easier to understand than pro-level intricacies. But there's also a lot there that you have to decipher through to figure out exactly what they're trying to say. So for the most part, wikis are a good point of reference, or if you have a mechanics question where you can search, say, an individual weapon or character in the game, and you'll get the entire list of what it does, and maybe even some descriptions from whoever runs the wiki of here's how you use it. And that can be a pretty good method of learning the core gameplay mechanics, but it can take some time to sort of dig in and find out what's really helpful for you at the time and what isn't. So generally, I still think beginner's guides are better. Later on, they can be a valuable resource. And next is the meta. Going straight to either Reddit or Discord, because those are generally where the more serious players are for the game. Going to those places, you will oftentimes find the players that no longer touch grass because of this game, and it will become obvious very quickly. This is the global competitive community usually congregates around Reddit and Discord. As a new player, this is the last place I would recommend going. Not so much because their information is really bad, as much as the information that you get is very one-sided. Because you will exclusively get what is meta, and these players are going to tell you to do exactly the meta and don't do anything else but the meta, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing to keep you from using the absolute worst options available. They will at least tell you that those options are bad and you should stop using them. And they can oftentimes guide you towards the most important fundamentals, but that comes at the cost of these players tend to disregard anything else, and that includes opinions. So you'll find a lot of competitive scenes tend to gatekeep any information that is remotely off meta. That's why I've heard the statement that competitive scenes ruin games. I used to be really against that statement, but taking a step back from competitive scenes, I've started to see the gatekeeping aspects and the silencing of any off-meta opinions or options, as well as just the general negativity towards the game. Typically, competitive players, the people that play the game almost religiously, are the ones that tend to be the most upset about it and complain about it all the time. Over time, I can see how a competitive scene has the capacity to change a game so much that it loses a lot of the fun mechanics in favor of more competitive mechanics. And that is why I would advise caution if you try to just jump into the competitive meta as a beginner, because if you're treating the game from the perspective of a beginner, you're going to be much more impressionable. And if you focus exclusively on meta chasing competitive players tell you to do, you're going to be bought into that mentality. In a way, that can be good, but I think it does more harm than good, because I have seen far too many times a player is informed of what the meta is, and they are told by these communities to do exactly this, and this is how you win. And then they go out and try to do that and don't have enough core fundamental knowledge to actually execute that. And so what happens is they throw for the team because they're trying so hard to do the correct option that they can't see the forest for the trees. And it can make players blind to their own faults because they're so focused on doing exclusively what is the meta. The most effective tactics available require the most effective players available. And if you're a beginner, meta's not going to help you. It's going to oftentimes hurt you. It's a good reference point, and you need to know what the game's meta is. Trying to become cookie cutter meta is how you turn into everyone's favorite matchup, because every competitive player that trains to improve is always prepared for cookie cutter meta. And if you're cookie cutter meta, you're throwing away wins because you're so predictable at that point that a well-played suboptimal option will oftentimes beat you, because if you're so meta focused, you're not going to even know what off-meta stuff does. And I've seen that happen too. The global community, that is the hyper-competitive, meta-focused people, good reference point, good to understand how they think, but do not take their advice too seriously. That is a trap that a lot of people get into. It is definitely the last place that I would go for exclusive knowledge. Now, not every global community is like that. The more casual games tend to have a community that is more casual. Those can be more helpful generally, but the more competitive a game is, the more I would actually avoid the competitive scene. I've been in enough of them to know that you can get so focused on meta that you forget you're even playing a game. And I think having a community that is incredibly meta focused and perfect optimization is not actually ideal because you need that offset, that balance, so that when a new player shows up, they can actually play the game and enjoy it, and not just be told, here's one way to play the game. This is the only way to play the game. You do not play the game any other way because every other way is bad and you're going to lose. That's not helpful, especially to a new player. And it can end up causing dev teams to make very questionable choices because those who chase the meta think the game should be played exclusively one way. That is a dangerous place to be in, where you get that tunnel visioned that you start to exclude other play styles that are anti-competitive. So please don't become one of those people. It is generally unhelpful, and you're just going to turn into another competitive random that everyone knows the matchup for, unless you are exceptional at the game, which would require you no longer touching grass. So unless you want to ruin your life to a video game, I would recommend you avoid getting too close to the hyper-competitive scene. Okay, those are generally the kind of places you can look for to get a proper understanding of the game, the fundamentals, what people think about the game anyway. So which do I think is best? I think a combination of all of them actually is good. The organic trial and error methods are a very good way of understanding how you learn. But if you combine that with wiki knowledge, what the competitive meta is, and what beginner's guides say, both casual and competitive, as well as what the pros think, a good mix of all of it is ideal, I would say. But I would start with the observation, trial and error combined with beginner's guides. I think that is going to be the best method for early development of your core fundamentals. In the next video, I'll probably get into what kind of fundamentals you need to look for the type of game, maybe even get into a few examples. But that should be a good enough understanding of the resources that you should be looking towards, as well as the viability of the resources knowledge for you as a beginner player. Anyway, if you think this type of content is helpful, you can click the algorithm buttons down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all next time.